Today is Friday, April 7, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here again with my co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. How are you doing today on this kind of rainy Friday morning?
I'm doing wonderfully. It's been a wonderful start to the holy days. I love a rainy day, and I'm ready to get going.
I think we love a rainy day because we work in an office with a window.
That's true. That we get to see it outside the window.
I could see some professions where you would be less excited about a rainy day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do we have for our topic this morning?
Our topic today is prompted by a question that was sent in. I want to say prompted by two things. We'll elaborate after the music. But one thing is prompted by, this was an actual question from one of our listeners, which is essentially, who in the world are you guys?
Yeah.
You know, why should I even listen to you? So anyway, today we're going to answer that question. Who are we?
Sounds good.
Welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast, and we didn't give our names. I guess my name is Wallace Smith. I'm sitting across the table from Mr. John Robinson, and those are very relevant things to note today because we are going to talk about who we are. We were prompted by the following question. Let me read this, and thank you to the listener who sent this in. Let's see. She wrote, "What is your position and job description, and can you tell us a bit about what you both do in the church and or your work history in the church and work?" And we thought about, it would be good to answer this question. We talk about some of those, at least some of these things in our very first podcast. If you don't go out to livingyouth.org and see what is out there, because there is more than the podcast out there, and we're hoping to add more and more as time goes on. But you can go all the way. This is podcast number 49 for us. I think we were talking about that earlier. I think this is our 49th one, but you can go back and you can see the very first one. And we kind of introduced things a little bit. We'll dive into things a little more here. But we thought this would be a good question to answer because you ought to know who we are. Some of you probably have absolutely no idea who we are. But also, there will be biblical principles to things we say because the whole theme of the podcast is learning to think biblically about things. So we will weave that in. And then we have to be honest, it's been a really busy week. We've had, of course, Passover earlier. By the way, the order, the days of the week and the holy days this year correspond to what they were when Christ was crucified. We had Tuesday night, Passover. Of course, Thursday was the high day, the first day of unleavened bread. The night before that, night much observed. We're getting a booklet together, inserts that have to go to the printer. We got a lot going on here. And we saw this question and thought, at the very least, we thought, well, this would be an easy one to answer. We should be instant experts in terms of this topic. Don't you think, Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, you would think this wouldn't require a lot of show prep.
Yeah, it could be famous last words, but yeah, we thought that this would be a good one to answer on a very busy week.
Well, and this also ties into a very, very early question we had, like one of the original, sourcing of topics we could do. Somebody asked a similar question about, hey, tell us a little bit about your path to the ministry and how did you know? And that is actually, well, I don't know if your story is interesting, but like it's brief, but kind of interesting how we ended up on that track.
Yeah. So we will tackle that today, if you will, and I hope it be kind of a different episode in that way. But even Paul, if you look at Paul when he's talking to those in Thessalonica. He talks about his affection for them, that he shared the gospel with them, of course, but also shared his life. He shared his life with them. So in this particular case, we do want to give you some of our backgrounds, where it is that we're coming from, how we came to be where we are. And also, again, by the time of the end, I think there will be some biblical reflection on why does any of this even matter? And I don't know if we didn't draw straws or anything, but Mr. Robinson, how about you get us started off in terms of your background, where you came from, and how you came to be sitting across the table from me.
So you and I, as we've mentioned on the podcast a number of times, our path into the church was different. You came in your late teens?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
And I was born into it, technically third generation, actually. My grandfather started attending services in 1950. My father was born in 1945, so he was 5. And even on my mom's side, it was kind of a similar path. And so grew up in the church. And that could be a whole other topic, I suppose, because I've talked to people who did not grow up in the church, and they feel like it really is. I mean, if you embrace your calling, it's a real advantage because you're not unlearning things, And,
Right.
I think, there's a couple that came into the church years ago where she really liked Christmas, and it was a big deal to have to drop Christmas. And with her, it was more a real family time kind of situation. And so, anyway, I learned that growing up in the church really should be viewed quite positively, and your access to the truth is easy to take for granted. But like, hopefully, as you get older, you'll start to realize, wow, I should not take for granted the truths I've learned in the church. But anyway, I had a professional career outside the church for over 20 years. I was hired to work for the church about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, into the editorial department, where I've worked ever since. At the time, the executive editor was Bill Bomer. And then after he resigned, you were already here at headquarters, and you moved over, and that's when you and I started working very directly together. My primary role here at headquarters is more related to art and layout and the design somewhat. Now that we have Mr. Ben Graham here, I give him all the design because he's better at it, and
he's amazing.
He loves doing it. And but then I've taken on a lot more of the role of just print logistics. I mean, we're keeping track of 37 booklets in addition to our ambitious schedule of 10 magazines every year, and
new
6
products.
LCNs.
That's right. Yep.
We've done a couple new booklets. We're altering how we're doing the semi-annual offer this year, and that was kind of a big deal for us. But and what was interesting was I was ordained and hired by the church within a 6-month period. So I was ordained in the spring, came to work here in December. I think that was 2012. Yeah. And have loved it. Honestly, love what we do here. I had an opportunity when my girls were in their teens to work in the teen camp a lot. Some may have known me from when we did that, but both our kids are grown, and we're not involved in the camp program anymore. But really enjoyed getting to meet so many of our youth and working with them, and it was a lot of fun. And it just, I like to think I had a good perspective on things, because for some reason I just really remembered what it was like to be a teen. I remembered all the things I didn't know that were, you sit there in church and some things are presented as if it was like clearly understood and you should know, and I was like, I don't know, and you don't want, and you don't want to. In fact, we talked about this at the Night to Be Much Observed a little bit. The idea of it is, are there stupid questions? And I tend to fall. I mean, technically there could be a stupid question, but in general, it's not a stupid question. You didn't know, you missed it for whatever reason, and so did my best to explain things the way I would want to have heard it when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I don't know where else I would
Now, did
go
you
from
explain what work you did before you were in the ministry?
So almost right out of high school, shortly after high school, I started working in what I would say the print and publishing field. And I've worked into it the whole time. I actually worked, in fact, the last 12 years before I came to headquarters was at the same print company. It's almost like I had 3 different careers there in the print company, because I started in one department. Then after a few years, I did outside sales for a little while. I wasn't that great at that, and then went back into an internal role that was different than what I did before. We got really involved in how the company was run and got to shape some of it. So print, my father had a master's degree in journalism. So
wow,
not that benefited me, but it kind of ran in the family a little bit to work in print and publishing.
I can reflect back. I mean, I could reflect on what Mr. Robinson does now, as in I can't imagine running the department without him. He talks about logistics and such, but really we have so many projects going on at any one time. And that doesn't just include in English. That includes international projects as well. And Mr. Robinson is very much, as the managing editor, is the focus of a great deal of that. And he's kind of my, without him, I wouldn't be able to keep my fingers on the pulse of anything going on. But he's got his fingers on those pulses, and that really helps me out a lot. And if you enjoy the layout of the magazine, he's the one who designed the layout of the magazine. If you don't like it, well, you don't
Yeah.
need to tell him. He doesn't need to know.
Exactly. Do not email.
But I do want to say, and I'll comment on this and give Mr. Robinson some more time if he has anything else to say. But I remember way back when, let's see, I was already in the ministry, and I met you, Mr. Robinson. I think when I say I met you, I'd already interacted with you. You'd been recommended to me by Mr. Senna. We had to do some printing concerning brochures for Feastside I was running, and we had some back and forth. But then I actually really more met you in person at a feast that Mr. Senna was running. It was one of those brief times when I was not having to run a feast. I didn't know I was going to have to run one the very next year. And anyway, that's the first time I actually met you, and I knew that you were in Texas, you were ordained. Mr. Senna was working with you and training you. And then I remember hearing you were hired to be at headquarters. And I remember being disappointed. Not in a bad way, but thinking, why, here's a really capable, minister, who's really, I remember you had at least one message. I remember that feast I enjoyed, and boy, he's being pulled here to headquarters and to, well, that's just one more minister not in the field. I was in the field at the time, and how it's like, boy, but then when I saw, I came here for telecast reasons. I'd be coming, fairly frequently for telecast purposes, and saw what you were being used to do with the magazine. And I realized, okay, God, I repent. I'm sorry. It's kind of, it's so easy to think sometimes we're just complaining about some decision that the church has made or something, when really it's Christ who is running the church, who's orchestrating all of these things. And, I'll try to remember. I don't always remember these things when I say them on the podcast, but I'll try to remember to post a cover from right before Mr. Robinson's tenure began, in terms of the being the one doing the layout of the magazine, and then the cover afterwards. And just to see, what you now recognize as the look and feel of tomorrow's world, with the logo and the things we do, as Mr. Robinson who did that. And when I saw the direction that the magazine was going in terms of just how much more beautifully it looked, and was a pleasure to read on a different level, more than just the good content, which had always been there. I thought, okay, God, you do know what you're doing. I have to repent. Jesus Christ is running his church, and there's a reason that Mr. Robinson was being put here, is because there was kind of like, God, this is going to sound like I'm really reaching, but just like Jesus Christ tells us, and many of us heard this over the Passover, that God is preparing rooms for us. He's preparing mansions, if you will. It's not, mansions isn't the best translation, but in his kingdom, God had a place here that he had prepared, and he brought Mr. Robinson to fill that spot. So, all credit to Christ in that regard, and I love everything that you've done with the magazine. And we're looking at doing some new things. We're looking at actually retouching some things and getting Ben Graham involved as well.
Well, one of the things I share with the LE students, because I think I've done this 3 times.
Okay.
So the LE students have twice a week. They have a forum. They have a forum and an assembly.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. McNair gets a wide range of guys to come in and talk to him. And so one of the things I tell the LE students was, I had this really fascinating work history for about 20 years that I could not figure out why I was having some of these experiences. And when I came to headquarters, within 6 months, I had used nearly every skill I had developed, experience I had. It was almost like the job truly was tailor-made for the skill set I had.
Interesting.
I tried really hard to move from print to a more web-based profession, and it just never worked. It's such a subjective thing, but it just truly felt like, for some reason, this door is not opening for me to have. I was involved with web projects, but it was never where I switched to where my core competency was more web-based, and it just always continued to be print and publishing. It was
yeah.
But then I came here, and it made perfect sense.
Now, we've talked about how so many of the principles are the same in terms of kind of common design fundamentals that you see in print and online, because editorial, we have to deal with both. But, at the same time, you've got specialists. And so we've got Ben Graham, who actually has had a professional career actually outside the church before coming to work for us, and doing those things online. And what you just said about wondering why in the world is my work history shaping up the way it is, and coming to find out that there was a purpose for that, that's going to tie to kind of let me foreshadow or preview what we'll say at the end. I believe that's going to tie in really, really strongly with what we talk about here at the end.
I'll just make one final comment about updating the magazine. The previous layout style, it had been like that for a long time, so it was kind of due for an update. And then Dr. Meredith, I think he did this commonly when he hired somebody. When somebody was new, he would have a one-on-one meeting with them. And so when I came out of that meeting, what I knew was he was ready for the magazine. He wanted the magazine to be updated in some way, and a refresh of the look and everything. So that's kind of what instigated that. And it was time, and now it's been that way, believe it or not, almost 10 years. I think it has been 10 years now. I think
it'll be this year, I think.
Yeah, in April. Back then it was March, April, and that was the first.
Oh, was it?
That was the first one, and it had it was perfect because it was the Pope, Pope Francis, and we put him on the cover, and that was the first one for the new, and that was pretty exciting.
It was.
But it's been 10 years, and I was just talking to Ben Graham this last week about hopefully in the next few issues doing not a significant update, but something of an update to refresh the look on it a little bit.
Yeah, I think refresh is probably a good way to put it. So before we move on, I don't want to jump to my story too quickly. Did you include in that, or did you want to include in that something reflecting the earlier question, the question from earlier in our podcast about being a minister, about that?
Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to go through your background first.
Oh no, actually, I'd rather put off mine.
That's funny. So this is a true story. Well, hopefully, I only tell the truth.
Hopefully you do.
That's
right.
That's the goal.
That's right.
So I was baptized when I was 25.
Okay.
And I remember when I turned 30, I was consciously aware of turning 30 and that Christ started his ministry at 30. And really, the Levitical priests weren't supposed to start. You couldn't operate in a priestly function until you were 30. I mean, you could be trained, but you couldn't be so there's this precedent, and it made sense to me because even though when you hit your 20s, you are a grown up now, like you're not a kid anymore. But there's a big difference between 21 and 30.
Yeah, there's still some maturing to happen. Yeah.
And so when I hit 30, I was like, okay, this makes perfect sense. You know, it's a funny phrase I say occasionally. It's almost like God knows what he's doing. And at 30, I really did take stock of my life and felt like I was not. So here's what's interesting about hitting certain milestones in your life, at least it was to me. At 30, I could look back over 5 years, because I got married and baptized the same year, 5 years of my history, and truly evaluate it. And when I evaluated that 5 years, I realized I was not doing a great job. Like, I need to make sure I do Bible study every day and all this. I was not doing Bible study every day, not at all, because I would try to do it in the evening and I would get tired. And that's part of why I advocate for Bible study in the morning, because if you get up early, that's not a bad time. I think it's actually a great time to do it, because at the end of the day, and you're exhausted and your family duties, they come up.
You definitely don't have your best to give to it anymore.
And that was actually another good point of it. Even when I did do it, it felt like it was really, I used that term earlier jokingly, but you're kind of mailing it in. Like you're just doing it because you have to do it, but you're not really focused on it.
Right.
And so I started working harder, and I did change my schedule to do that. But up till I was 35, I'm telling everybody in the audience, this is true. I thought I would live, have children, and die having never so much as been a song leader. That's something other people do. I didn't think about it for me. And of course, I didn't escape being song leader very long, because a lot of the church areas aren't very big, and they need men to do that. So I did song leading for a while, but the real change, I know you're out there, Mr. Senna, was when Phil Senna came into town. And I think I was 36, and he came into town, and he took stock of all his congregations and all his men. I've always viewed Phil Senna as an excellent developer of young men. He likes to do it, and he's good at it. And he put me on the speaking schedule to start giving sermonettes. And I was not at all excited about that. I never thought that would happen. But I thought, well, at 36, having grown up in the church, I should be able to do a sermon.
Right.
And so I really did embrace it. And after a couple of Bible studies, a couple of sermonettes, he had been listening to, I think he had 5 church areas, and he was not satisfied with how the sermonettes were being done. And so he implemented the sermonette guidelines. And not everybody was excited about them, but I was, because I was brand new. And so it was the perfect time for me, because I didn't have a style yet. I didn't have a habit. And so he came in with these guidelines, and they were fairly restrictive. But even at the time, I kind of had this sense that I think that's good. This is good. A sermonette really should only be 12 minutes, which naturally restricts how it's going to be. So this is already more than I thought I was going to say. So anyway, I really embraced doing sermonettes, and over the years got better and better at them, and felt like I had the formula down. And learning how to speak concisely is a very, very valuable asset.
Yeah.
And it carries over into sermons when later I did start giving sermons. But I really did not ever think about, I didn't think about even giving a sermon that, let alone that there was ever a time. But there was a time I met with Mr. Senna in the evening. I don't even remember why we met. And he said, one of the things he said, and I don't even know how conscious this was. It would be interesting to ask him if he even remembers. But he said, "You have leadership potential," and that hit me. And then later, I'm like, well, what does that mean? What is leadership potential?
Right.
And I had it be the most baseline thing. Leadership potential can just truly merely be there in your congregation. You're a guy that the minister can rely on to set things up, to open up the hall.
Like Christ says, leadership is serving,
Yep.
and you have the capacity to really serve and really make a difference.
But after another year or two, I remember the first time I allowed myself to consciously think, what if he thinks I could be a minister? And it felt, I'm telling you, internally, the most internally bearing my soul thing I think I've ever done. It felt so presumptuous to think that. It really did. Yeah, right, Robinson. You maybe a minister, right? And but what was good? What was good about that for me is it was still another year, at least another year away from that happening, becoming ordained. So I was ordained as a deacon. I was a deacon for 2 years, and almost exactly 2 years later, I was ordained to be an elder. It gave me a time to get used to the idea. It would have been, that was actually better for me, I think, than him maybe having started off saying, "Hey, I think you have the potential to be a minister one day." That I don't know how that would have turned out, but it was better for me in my own process to slowly but surely think, because then it made me like start looking at things differently. Like, what would you do? Ministers have a hard job, and they have to make difficult calls on things. And one of the things I learned about the ministry was we rarely have all the, like, we as lay members, we don't have all the facts. And so sometimes the way a decision is made by a minister seems puzzling, or maybe you even think it's wrong.
Right.
And a lot of times it's because we just didn't know everything. So just having to start, you talk about the podcast being thinking biblically. Like for me, it was like thinking ministerially, like trying to have that perspective, and like, what would you do? And what, very different just to sit back and be critical of the decisions of the leadership versus now you have to make those calls. And that mindset switch is a big deal for you. You do make decisions differently when you have the responsibility on you. With all the COVID stuff, who would want to be Mr. Weston in that situation? Mask or not mask? Then are we going to mask at the feast? Is everybody going to mask even in states where you don't have to have masks? All these things, difficult calls, not popular. You're not going to win. There's going to be a group that's unhappy with the way you make the call. And that was just one of those times I thought, man.
Yeah, heavy is the head that wears the crown, and it moves you to pray for those people. I remember the same thing about Mr. Agwin, even, whom I loved as a pastor, was just amazing. He made a few calls here and there. They're like, well, why? Not sure about that. Not sure I would do that. And then you find yourself in that position, and you find yourself making very similar calls for reasons you didn't even perceive before. But now you see a larger picture.
Well, and the final comment I'll make, though, is that once I knew that it was going to happen, I mostly let go of any misgivings I had, not perfectly, and just tried to embrace the role and the responsibility. And that if you're a good leadership is a blessing to the people. And so to the degree that I could do my best to do a good job and hopefully be helpful and beneficial, because it really is a serving role, and sometimes that can be forgotten.
Right. No, it is. It does mean you're a servant. Well, concerning myself,
Yeah, enough about me. What, what about you?
boy, how far back do I go? So, I've talked before about my calling into the church, and when does a calling really start? I
Mm.
like to think that God is always planting little seeds and preparing the soil. But I've mentioned before that I began watching the telecast when I was 14. Uh, Eventually began attending when I was 18, and the only person in my family, but definitely had no thoughts of being in the ministry, to be sure. I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a high school math teacher. I knew that from maybe about junior high. I can't recall. I loved math. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't love math?
I hated math, but truly, and having worked with you over the years, I've come to appreciate math, and
Oh,
you've
thanks.
made me appreciate math more and want to be better.
Oh, well, that's all a old math teacher can hope for. I definitely loved math, and what I enjoyed most about it, other than just reading about it and the ideas it would make me think of, but I enjoyed explaining it to other people. I really, really enjoyed that. So I just felt that for some reason God wanted me to be a math teacher. That was kind of what I thought. So when I went to college and got my math degree, that's just what I presumed I would do.
Texas
Was teach
A&M.
math. Texas A&M University.
Good engineering school. I mean, like I was in Austin, and my brother went to UT, so I had to be loyal more to the Longhorns. But
Right.
respect for a good that's a
Oh,
good
thanks.
university.
How look at us, an Austin guy and a College Station guy sitting at the same table. It shows you
I
can.
wasn't that committed to them, and
Good.
it really
Good.
was a liberal school, and after a while, it's kind of
Yeah.
like I don't know.
Well, we used, I know they used to, maybe they still do. They used to have T-shirts for those who don't realize, the Texas A&M in College Station, Texas, and the University of Texas, which at A&M we say Texas University because we think we are the University of Texas. But anyway, University of Texas and Austin were big rivals, and I know in Austin, because it really is a pretty weird place, they at least used to have shirts that would say "Keep Austin Weird."
Mm-hmm.
And College Station, in response, we made shirts that said "Keep College Station Normal." So that was,
Did you
anyway,
really?
that's
I
kind
didn't
of the
know that.
spirit of that, yeah. But regardless, I went to college, got my degree in mathematics, graduated, got married, and was teaching high school math, and was doing that for, I think I taught math for 5 years. Four of those, the latter four, had the privilege of getting to teach calculus, but kind of taught the whole range. Taught the calculus, which was the top class that they could offer mathematically, but then also taught fundamentals of math and really consumer math, essentially what we used to call it back when I was in high school. Just trying to make sure that the kids know how to balance a checkbook, and file their taxes and those. So I really got to teach the whole range, and did love teaching math. Stressful teaching even then in the public schools. I had a kid once got knifed in the stomach from a gang fight, and all sorts of things.
Like
That was
in the classroom.
not in the classroom,
Okay.
thankfully. No, because I would have taken him out with my amazing skill. No, I'm just kidding. I would have, I don't know what I would have done. Thankfully, I didn't have to face that. But no, thankfully, it was outside of class time. But though when I was doing my student teaching, I remember that's the semester you teach as a student, but learning it's kind of part of your on the job training before you get certified. I did have a student that I remember was so behind in algebra 2, and I was working with, because he just was missing a lot of class, and I was doing my best to help this guy. And he didn't seem interested at all, but I'm not allowed to not be interested. I've invested in him. I'm trying to help him catch up. And then come to find out he's gone one day because he gets arrested because he'd been dealing drugs on campus this whole time. And I thought, here am I devoting myself trying to help this kid get caught up in algebra 2, and he's got an entire drug enterprise going on the side. What was not on his mind all that time was algebra 2. It was on my mind. So there's a lot of reality going on. But regardless, I loved teaching. I loved trying to explain these abstract concepts. And then we finally got pregnant. I say we got pregnant. Really, my wife was pregnant. I just never lost the weight from having a baby. We had Jonathan coming along, and I had to make a decision because my wife was working while I was teaching, because at least on a Texas teacher's salary, especially just first starting, it just wasn't enough. And so she was working and I was working, but both of us had agreed before we got married that if we had children, which we were wanting to have, that she would work from home, that she would be at home to be with those children and be a stay-at-home mom, which really is always going to be a work-at-home mom. I always hate the idea of just stay at home, like you're just sitting around watching television. Believe me, she worked harder at home than she did outside the home. But I just could not figure out a way to do that on a Texas teacher's salary at the time. So that pressed me to find a different job. And in finding a different job, I found actuarial work, which I enjoyed very much. It's essentially, an actuary is a mathematician who supports, it's not always an insurance company, but it's often an insurance company. When someone says that if you smoke, you're X percentage more likely to die than someone who doesn't smoke, that's generally an actuarial determination. The actuaries help insurance companies to know what to charge for their insurance policies, so that they're not only can they cover any claims, but they're also making an appropriate profit. In fact, it's one of the things I enjoyed about being an actuary is we had a product in, I can't remember which product it was where I used to work, but they were actually charging too much. That is, not enough of the policyholder's dollar was going to pay potential claims. And that was part of our job, was to say, hey, this price is a little too high. You've got, you're not giving the customer enough value based on, but it involves a lot of projection into the future, a lot of data analysis. And I really did enjoy that work. I was sad not to be teaching math anymore until about the time I got my first paycheck, and thought, oh, this is okay. I'm a little better with this. This is nice. But that enabled us at least to go to one income, which was important to us. We still had to kind of scrape a lot to make it happen, especially once we would get up to four boys. But still was important to us, and we're able to achieve that. Well, all that time,
So you didn't have to go back to school for that? You just studied for it?
No. Well, you can actually, especially I think it's really multiplied, but I could have gone to college and narrowed on actuarial sciences. I didn't. I wanted a pure math degree, so I got a pure math degree versus applied math or other things. However, you can focus on actuarial sciences. It's definitely a particular branch of mathematics. In fact, when I did get my first actuarial job, I got it at below starting level financially, because they normally expected someone who comes on the job to have at least their first actuarial exam under their belt. And I did not have any actuarial exams under my belt. They probably gave me some leeway, because back then, the exam system is always kind of evolving and changing. But back then, the first actuarial exam was calculus. And I'd literally been teaching calculus for 4 years. So I think they presumed I was going to be able to pass calculus.
So you didn't even study?
That one, I do not recall studying for the calculus test. Now, the one after that, which I took on the same day, was the statistics test. And I did want to make sure, even though as an actuary, well, I wasn't an actuary yet, I had studied a lot of statistics in college. And so thankfully the concepts were not new to me, but I did make sure I was more refreshed on some of that, because as a calculus teacher, I had not revisited that since college. So no, I got those 2 exams under my belt pretty quickly. And yet, even without the exams and starting at below entry level salary, I still just totally smoked my teacher salary. It was amazing. It's amazing how much we don't value teachers on one hand, but on the other hand, it's difficult too, because we look at, these days you have so many teachers rising up as if they have the right to re-engineer our children and society. So it's such an odd mix there. But I did enjoy my time teaching. It was definitely stressful, but I loved those kids and loved working with. The high school age was such a nice age to work with, because they're still forming a lot of worldviews, but they're old enough to think and to reason. Even if their brains are still forming, they've hit an age where you can start to work with reason. So all of you out there, that's one of the reasons I enjoy getting to work with you, is because that age range I always enjoyed so much. But as an actuary, that was great work. It was very much like the comic strip Dilbert. Had a cubicle, had a computer, had an amazing boss. Her name was Annie, wonderful French Canadian, and then her boss, and then her boss. And anyway, things changed over 5 years. I did that it wasn't just 5 years. I was an actuary for about 8 years, I think, and really enjoyed getting to use my mathematical skills and Microsoft Excel and spreadsheets, and enjoyed doing all of that work. And then very unexpectedly, Mr. John Agwin, who was my pastor at the time, told me the church wanted to hire me into the ministry.
So that literally completely out of the blue?
It was out of the blue. Now, I had been giving sermonettes, and how did that happen? The previous pastor, before Mr. Agwin arrived, wanted to add some new sermonette speakers. And so he did kind of a hybrid thing at the time. It was like Spokesman Club, but not exactly Spokesman Club. We would really recommend just go ahead and do Spokesman Club. But at the time, he was trying to figure out how to do things. So he had sort of a mini sermonette club, if you will, and had taken some of us and assigned some things. And
so how old were you when you started giving sermons?
that's a good question, Mr. Robinson. I don't know. I think Jonathan was already born, so I was at least 27.
Okay.
I think I was at least 27 because Jonathan was born when I was 27. I'm not 100% sure about that. It was definitely after the Worldwide Church of God fell apart. So yeah, Jonathan was probably already born. It was definitely in the Global Church of God at the time. And I was added to the song leading list because they needed song leaders. You mentioned it earlier. That's actually one of the things I believe that God has worked out since the fall and dissolution of the Worldwide Church of God. Was congregations almost instantly became much smaller, and a lot of people who were content to be in the background didn't get the opportunity to be in the background anymore. Suddenly you are pressed to fill a need.
Well, Austin was a 400-person congregation.
I remember.
And then after the fall, the congregation was 50 people maybe.
Oh, wow.
40, 45 people. But you're right. You get pressed into surface. In fact, I might have said this on the podcast before, but we had 2 deacons in our church area, and each one of them left for different reasons. And suddenly there was nobody else to do it.
Right.
And so that's why Sean Dubois and I started, because there was the need.
Yeah.
It was just that simple.
That's what happened to my father-in-law. He loved serving. He loved serving, and he would serve behind the scenes and didn't want anyone to know that he was serving. And then you're in a small congregation. We need a song leader, and if you can count to 4, I think you're it. Next thing you know, you're up there doing that. So that was kind of the case for me. The congregation was small. I was added as a song leader, and then the sermonettes got the attention of the pastor. I was added to the sermonette list. And then Mr. Agwin comes on the scene, and next thing I know, I was added to split sermons as well. And then, came Mr. Agwin's visit. It was interesting. I could have known something was up because he said he was coming over to visit and want to make sure that we might be available. And I said, oh, well, yeah, that's normally, we were really blessed to have both him and Mr. David Burson at the time. And both of them were doing Bible studies, monthly Bible studies in the area. And we would go to both of them. So it happened to be the evening that was going to be Mr. Burson's Bible study. And so when Mr. Agwin called, I said, oh, yeah, definitely. We were planning on going to the Bible study, but if you want to come that night, he's like, oh, yeah, I'd still like to come that night. It's like, okay, that sounds great. So he came over, we had dinner, and we were just in the living room talking, and that's when he told me that the church wanted to hire me in the ministry. And that really was not expected. I'd been given no, kind of clues. And on my part, I'm kind of the other way. I'm kind of glad. I think it would have started to mess with my head a little bit. And I'll say, going back, when I graduated college in 1992, actually December 91, but I was class of 92, I was thinking to myself way back then, well, maybe afterwards I should go to Ambassador College. Once I get once I finish here, because I was already in college when I began attending my freshman year. I thought, well, maybe when I wrap this up, I ought to go to Ambassador College. That's because I would love to learn more. I'd love to understand more. And what I ended up concluding was, what? I'm not going to do that. That's what you do if you're going to be in the ministry, and I'm not going to be in the ministry.
That really was the reputation.
It really, exactly. And I know that's not accurate. Many people have gone and did not go in the ministry. They just went for the education. But it just seemed excessive. It seemed like, look, Smith, you're going to have a degree. You ought to go out there and start being productive, and stop spending more time in college. And it's not like you're going to be in the ministry or anything. That's not even in the works at all. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, God knows. And same as what you're saying. I remember talking with Mr. Millich, and I had the privilege of training under Mr. Rand Millich in Kansas City as I was training for the ministry. And we talked about the fact that I really do believe, like you said, it was kind of a weird collection. I thought, well, why did I feel like God wanted me to be a math teacher, right? And then suddenly I'm an actuary. I'm not even a math teacher anymore. Everything I'd hoped for years to be one day, I'm not doing that anymore. And yet I can look at both my time teaching math and I can look at my time working as an actuary, even with spreadsheets and such, not the spreadsheets themselves, but the principles and the thinking behind that. And I would say every bit of that I've brought into the ministry in terms of in speaking and such. So anyway, I was out in the field for a good number of years, and some of you who are listening are in congregations I used to pastor, and thank you for sticking with it, even with me out there, and surviving me as a pastor, but being out there in the field, still think of all of you often and love all of you. And Dr. Meredith told me for many years, well, actually, I guess I should mention that. So how to end up on the telecast. After I auditioned for the telecast. Not because I volunteered for that. That's just not how things work in the ministry. Rather, while I was training, Mr. Ames sent me an email and said they would like me to audition for the telecast. They were wanting to add a third presenter. And I was like, whoa, that was very unexpected. That definitely came out of nowhere. And then,
how do you suspect you got on their radar?
I actually know exactly how I came on their radar in this case. There was a guy who did know me, who was visiting headquarters at the time, and because I was just a trainee out in trainee land, and Dr. Meredith and Mr. Ames, I think, were having lunch with him, and they were planning this. They had lined up a bunch of people to audition, because they wanted to take a look and see how they did on set. And I think it was Dr. Meredith, from what I've heard, just happened to ask, well, hey, so-and-so, is anyone you have in mind you think you ought to recommend, any minister out there? And he said, you know what? I do have someone in mind. And he said, Wallace Smith, you should have Wallace Smith audition.
What? The trainee?
What? That guy? I doubt he can open a can of Coke, let alone, or a car door, let alone. Anyway, and boy, they took that seriously and they added me to the list. So
that's amazing. I don't know if I've ever heard that.
Oh, really? Yeah. It's interesting too. It was such a privilege because Mr. Aguin had been the third, presenter before he died, and getting that opportunity to get to do that was just meant a lot to me. So anyway, that's how that happened. And I was so nervous. We had a big ministerial conference. It was my first general ministerial conference. And they'd asked me, do I want to just take, they try to be cost efficient. Let's combine it with this trip. Do you want to do it before the conference or after the conference? And I said, wow, let's do it before the conference. I can't imagine the nervousness of waiting the whole conference, before doing that. So I did that before the conference. So anyway, that's how I got added to the telecast. And Dr. Meredith did tell me for years. I joked that he threatened me, quote unquote, because I loved being out in the field. But he said, I'm going to pull you in eventually. We're going to want you to, whether it's do more telecast or whatever. And I said, well, I know Dr. Meredith, but I love being out in the field. And then he eventually did make that decision that he thought it was time. And I do think God was really moving Dr. Meredith to put a lot of things in place. Eventually, brought Mr. Weston here, presiding evangelist. And
Dr. Meredith, I don't know if he gets enough credit for what an excellent job he did setting the church up for the future.
I think he was so responsive to God's design and making sure things were in place that needed to be in place. Yeah. It really is remarkable. And so anyway, that's how we came to be here. So that said, we did want to, I feel like we've already illustrated one of those things, Mr. Robinson, in both of our stories. I like to think, again, the theme is thinking biblically. We want to examine things not just in terms of what we think. We want to examine things in terms of what God thinks. And in terms of thinking biblically, part of what I would recommend, Mr. Robinson's life, actually, he seemed to have a more direct example of it, but I do believe that it applied to mine too, is that God tells us to take a certain attitude with our work and with our jobs. We see that reflected, for instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10, where we're told, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. I mean, take it seriously, he is saying. Really pour yourself into the things you're doing. He continues, for there's no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Your life right now is the only opportunity, it's the only time you have to actually do the things you're going to do before you die. And Solomon tells us to take that seriously. But taking that seriously, when you really look at the context of what Paul says and others say in the New Testament, it kind of raises that to another level. Because Paul mentions, and he mentions this kind of thing in lots of different places, but in Colossians chapter 3, starting at verse 18, just to get a little context, he says, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bond servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And taking what he's really building, all this fits in the same theme. He says in verse 23, and whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the word of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. You know, that kind of idea that no matter what you're doing, I know maybe you're working for someone at Pizza Hut, and the manager might be kind of a jerk, and you just don't understand why he does things the way he does because it just makes the pizzas cold before they get out to the customers, or whatever the case is, whatever circumstance in which you find yourselves, pour yourself into doing it as if you were serving Jesus Christ himself, because Christ is able to work with those things. And I wish I could look back on my life and say that I always did that, Mr. Robinson, and I know that I didn't. But I do believe that in those areas where I did, and again, not everything, but in those areas where I did, in the end, rather than just serving a job, I like to think, and I pray this is the case, it gave God an opportunity to equip me with tools in life, skills that I've developed that I was able to use in a variety of circumstances. And in my particular case, it ended up being in the ministry. But in a local congregation, that can be being able to serve a member in need, or in a family where you have a son or daughter in a circumstance and you happen to have developed skills in your life that you can actually bring to bear in their lives. That if we will devote ourselves to thinking of our jobs, our careers, our employment, not just as a means of making money, but a means of actually growing skills and talents and pouring ourselves into so that we give God something to work with in our lives, then God, I believe, will use those things in our lives in some kind of capacity. I feel like your story, Mr. Robinson, I can't imagine why you said yourself, you were kind of wondering why you have the job path you do, and then all those skills were eventually brought to bear here.
Yeah, no, sitting here listening to you talk about that made me start thinking about that again. And so what I would say, if you're out there listening to this podcast, God is working. That means God is working in your life. And the probability that the life experience you're having right now is actually helpful and prepping you for something that you don't know down the line is extremely high. I mean, I want to say God carefully orchestrates every element of our life. I mean, who knows exactly where that tension is, but he's very directly involved in our lives, and he's giving you the experience you need for where you're going to be later, if you'll embrace it.
Right. Don't flee from it. Don't run from it, but learn to embrace those experiences and to recognize, even if you don't always see the purpose, God sees the purpose. And we see that historically. I know Dr. Winnail, a lot of others, they love to bring out examples like Moses shepherding sheep, for 40 years or whatever it was. Even Moses had to think to himself sometimes, man, I was a prince in Egypt, and hey, I kind of like this simple life. It's nice, but who would have thought, right? Who would have thought, oh, I bet God is having me shepherd these animals because he's going to actually have me shepherd his entire people. No, if anything, the moment that he tried, in a sense, to shepherd God's people while they were in Egypt, he ends up getting, chased down, he has to run out. He has to flee. It doesn't work out that way, and yet God was preparing him.
40 years.
40 years. What did I say?
No. I'm just.
Oh, you're chiming in, right? 40
yeah.
years of preparation.
I had the Bible study. I mentioned this before, in February, and so I went through that first 20 chapters of Exodus, and so it was a lot of fun to go through that. But I 40 years as a prince in Egypt, in the court of Pharaoh's daughter. 40 years shepherding. That is a long time.
It is.
And and then you go through the rest of the Exodus and into Numbers and Deuteronomy, and you think, no, I think Moses needed 40 years to get ready for the children of Israel.
Yeah, what kind of degree program are you on? I'm on the 40-year plan. It's getting ready, but absolutely.
Well, you don't really get any sense that Moses Like he was not excited when God called him to.
He was reluctant.
Yeah.
Here's the guy that was already ready to start saving his people, and he kills an Egyptian to try to save his brother. And then 40 years later, he's like, I don't know, God. I don't know, And
Surely by the hand of someone else.
That's right. That was such a good Bible study that you did. I really enjoyed that. So that's our message for you. It's been a little weird, perhaps, just sitting here talking, responding to this question. Thank you for the question. Responding to this and talking about ourselves, but at the same time, let's turn the question back on you. The question was, hey, who in the world are you guys? Well, let's ask you, who in the world are you? I'll tell you who you are. You are either currently or have the potential to become a child of God. Now, some of you are baptized, some of you aren't. Regardless, you're here in this faith. You have a future ahead of you, the details of which you do not know. None of us know indeed. We know the overall arc of prophecy, but we don't know the details of our life and how they're going to play out. And you are someone that God is working in your life to prepare for all those things that are ahead that you don't know yet. Family, children, conflict with coworkers, maybe some moment you're going to have to stand up and defend the faith in the face of others. Maybe sometime when there's going to be an elderly widow in your congregation who has a special need, and you'll be the person he can use to fill that. You don't know what those things are. All you know is the life you have right now and the opportunities in front of you. And what both of us would encourage you to do is to, whatever your hand finds to do, assuming it's godly and it's not something inappropriate, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Pour yourself into the things you have to do. Learn to do jobs not just to the satisfaction of your boss, but learn to go above and beyond. Learn to do them well if you can, and become good at what you do and be diligent at what you do. And then just trust God to make the most of that in the ways that he will make the most of it. I wouldn't have thought doing math for an insurance company would have some sort of broader implication in my life. And yet I do see myself using some of the mental principles I gained in doing that work. I wouldn't say on a daily basis, might be an exaggeration, but truly on a regular basis.
I'm sometimes marvel. I mean, you're right. It doesn't happen every day or maybe even every week, but I've noted how often your math ability and experience has benefited our department and our roles and things we're doing. So, and if I need a spreadsheet to do something, I always know who to come to. Mr. DeSimone is also pretty handy.
He
with
is.
his spreadsheet. He is. Yeah. I just in closing, I went back and looked it up. So the first football game between the Texas Longhorns and the Texas A&M Fighting Aggies was in 1894. So that people can understand how deep this rivalry was.
It does go back a ways.
It goes back. What does it take? Like an hour and a half to drive from Austin to College Station?
About an hour and a half. Yeah, we were, at least it was. We were an hour and a half away from a lot of other congregations, and I think it was about an hour and a half.
Long, it says on here also current win streak Texas won. They haven't played since 2011, but it looks like they're going to play next year.
Oh, really? Because they're in different conferences now. Our fight song actually mentions them. I remember one of my teachers just thought, this is supposed to be a world-class university, and yet your fight song focuses on this one local rivalry. But, it's just the way it is.
Well, I mean, you could have a pretty terrible football year, but if you at least beat the Aggies or vice versa, then you salvaged your year.
That's right. Well, hey, I think we'll wrap up with, what has that taught us? Here we have a man of Austin on one side of the table and a man of College Station. And here we are sitting at one table as brothers. Mr. Robinson, our relationship is a picture of the millennium and the peace to come.
World peace is possible. Not even possible. Not even probable. It will happen.
It will happen.
That's one of the things you and I have talked a lot about in the last year or two, and I'm not sure why it's been on our mind so much, but and this gets into a whole different podcast, and you might have to cut this out, but just there's something truly encouraging about fully embracing that God has a plan to fix everything, because not just fix everything, world peace will occur.
Right.
Christ will come and he will do the things. Really struck me. That's one of the stories of Exodus when I went through it, was the constant emphasis of God as the eternal. Always been there, always will be, not going anywhere. Got a plan, I will execute it. Nobody can stop me, and it will result in the millennium, and then of course on down into eternity. So.
Smith and Robinson.